gonna take a lot of love to change the way things are.
No mai, haere mai, and welcome to the Caravan of Hope with me, Brent Caldwell.
And me, Kodomati.
And today it's our very special pleasure to welcome Ingrid Leary, MP for Taieri here in Otago and member of our House of Representatives.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I was saying a wee bit earlier that you can think you know your MP by what you read in the paper, by what you see online, but as we know, that there's usually a real life person behind whatever is mentioned in the press or in the news. So, Ingrid, I wonder if you could start by just telling us a wee bit about yourself, a wee bit of your whakapapa maybe, and what's brought you to being this point now as an MP for Taieri here in Aotearoa.
Well, thank you for the question. And first, I'd just like to acknowledge, if I may, Anne-Marie Parsons. I know this podcast will go to air at some point after her funeral, but it is her funeral today, and she was a very active member of the Abrahamic Interfaith Group here in Otipoti and also of the Labour Party. When I think of the types of values that you are espousing here on this podcast, I think Anne-Marie really exemplified those. She was incredibly generous and contributing, and I just really want to acknowledge her today.
Kia ora.
As far as me, I'm 58 years old, mother of three. I still have my youngest 12-year-old at home, which is a real blessing. The other two are living, I've got a son in the army and a daughter at jazz school in Wellington. I've lived in Dunedin for about 6 years now. I was lucky enough to get selected and get the seat, taking over from Claire Curran in 2020. And my background has mainly been, if I look at it kind of from sectors, it looks a bit disjointed. It's been journalism, law, and international relations. If I think about it from a values perspective, it's about trying to create spaces for voices that don't get heard so that we can have more social justice.
Okay. That's a very short and potted history. I was looking at your bio on Wikipedia, and I can see that you have done an awful lot. And in a way,
because I'm getting old.
But in a way, it made me realise that when people enter Parliament, they bring with them a specific life experience, and they bring with them a specific view. As you know, this podcast is being devised in relation to the events in Gaza, and I'm wondering if you can maybe tell us about what your feelings are about what's happened there, and as an MP, what the challenges are about taking action.
If I think of the first feelings that would come up for me would be incredible frustration, as well as sadness and despair in some ways. I don't want to be without hope, but it has been so frustrating to watch the world inertia to recognise what has clearly been an unfolding genocide and an absolute humanitarian crisis. I don't have much time for the kind of conceptual and I believe quite academic arguments about the legalities of the genocide, when the reality on the ground is that we are seeing hundreds of thousands now of particularly children losing their lives through the actions of a hostile state. So, of course, my approach is to be in step with my party, and we have been much more vocal in opposition. It was very difficult at the beginning when we were in caretaker government mode, and there are protocols around that. So I do have some sympathy for our leaders because they shared my frustration. I would, first like to see, of course, a lasting peace deal, but I would like to see sanctions, and I would like to especially see humanitarian visas available to the families of those who live in New Zealand. In fact, I spoke about that in Parliament just a couple of days ago. I'm about to put a social media post online. We have a lot of Palestinians here in Dunedin, and they have worked tirelessly despite their incredible grief over what's happening. So the dominant emotion is probably frustration.
Okay. So I get, just listening to the answer of that question, I kind of thought it must be a real balancing act to have your personal view, but also to be in step with your party view. How do you navigate that?
That is the dance of politics, isn't it? And I do that in my own way, so whether that is successful or not depends on who's looking at it. I am probably known as being fairly outspoken within our caucus. I feel that the people of the South, the mandate that I have is that people here feel very strongly about social justice, and I think people here feel that you cannot have peace without justice. And so my mandate comes from the people here, and I do my level best to try to shake at the tree as much as I can while maintaining enough influence in my caucus to be able to be effective. If you are out of step too far, you lose the confidence of your caucus members and positions that enable influence. If you are too in sync sometimes, or maybe too conformist, perhaps there's a danger of not representing the constituency. That is the reality that I live with, and I'm very conscious of it, and I do my level best to try and navigate that, and I don't always get it right, but by and large I feel that I do, and I'm hoping that the election results both last time and hopefully next time will reflect that.
So are you getting lots of approaches and messages from your constituents about what to say to your own party and people on the other side of the house?
I do get some. To be fair, I think people realise that I am across what their feelings are. I do attend the protests when I can, and I speak with the community. I'm quite plugged into members of the community, and in fact I've done probably more than 20 written parliamentary questions on the question about the visas for families, including where Palestinians sit compared to other groups. I have asked about citizenship questions. I've got Official Information Act requests in. So there's quite a lot of behind the scenes stuff that happens. I work very closely with Councillor Christine Gary on this, who is probably the conduit to the community along with Marie Laufiso. So I'm quite in tune, I think, with what the community wants. And I also try to connect them to our spokesperson. Our strong spokesperson in this area would be Phil Twyford.
Yeah.
We also have our Foreign Affairs spokesperson, Penny Henare. So there's a bit of a dance with where the caucus sits, but pretty across our local community views.
What would you say to people here in Dunedin about what they could do to advocate to their MPs or to the government about, I don't know, if I take the recent example of the recognition of the Palestinian state recently, I mean, to be sitting here and watching that on TV was quite a frustrating and embarrassing moment for someone who has great pride in the country. What can people do to try and change the government's view on that?
Yeah, it's interesting because even in Parliament, at the back wall, in the back entrance as you come into the House of Representatives, where we all sit, there is a big plaque that recognises Palestine. So in some ways it feels like the official parliamentary view is out of step, not only with our allies, but actually with our House of Representatives that has a recognition of Palestine visibly on the walls.
What's the history of that?
I need to find out, but I know it has been there for a number of decades. So that's a good piece of homework for me. In terms of what people can do, my view is that the local community here in Ōtepoti has been incredibly effective, to the point where I was having a discussion the other day with a journalist about why there are certain members of the cabinet that don't come down here, and that has been a result of some pretty staunch protesting when ministers have come down for other announcements and the protesters have been there. I would encourage them to keep that up, to keep organising, and also to continue to do those vigils and those marches that happen on a regular basis. They won't always make national headlines, but they frequently do. And MPs, the way we can facilitate sometimes, and what I've done previously, is just being able to connect some of the organisers of those rallies with journalists at Radio New Zealand and send up some of the live audio so that they have been able to get onto the national news. we don't have enough journalists down here. ODT, I think, does a great job, but when it comes to national media, there is a paucity of journalists, so anything we can do to help connect the very visible frustration from the community here to journalists, we're very happy to do that.
Mm. Did you have a question, Kavita?
I was going to actually ask you a little bit about, you did some work with the Commonwealth, something or other, Institute, is it? Or
Commonwealth Women Parliamentarians?
Commonwealth Women Parliamentary. I was going to ask you about that too, because one of my theories is that until we actually get women running the world, because at the moment most of the problems seem to come from male leaders who are very kind of, I don't know, they're kind of just into their own things and quite violent to the rest of the world. And so my own sense is that until we actually have women leading the world, we probably won't do it, because men tend to just kind of act for their own interests, or the people who are backing them, their interests. Whereas what I've noticed more with women is they tend to actually discuss and make relationships with other women. And in this kind of situation, I'm thinking, well, actually, if women got together, particularly women from Palestine and women from Israel, but also all over the world, Ukraine, you know, wherever it is, they're kind of going, well, actually, I don't want my son, my husband, my brother to be killed. Neither do you. You know, whereas it seems like the leaders are just kind of, okay, well, it's, you know, in Russia I had this thing, it was 7,000 Russians getting killed a week, soldiers, and it's just kind of Putin, it's just a number for him, you know. But for the 7,000 families each week, you know, so that's 350,000 years, been going on for 4 years, that's over 1 million. In the Russian, probably the same for the Ukrainians.
One of the things that UN Women have recognised internationally is that in any of these so-called peace deals, which more and more seem to be brokered by politicians rather than groups of specialists, traditionally there has been very few women involved, and the call from UN Women is please involve us. Because if you want lasting peace, women need to be part of the solution. We are part of the community, we need to be part of the solution. I watched the Prime Minister movie the other night for the first time, and am just really reminded of the difference in leadership that Jacinda Ardern brought to the world, along with some other women leaders. I think the challenge is perhaps not the gender so much of the leaders, but the patriarchy in which we are required to operate. And it is very patriarchal, and this is coming from someone I've worked as a lawyer and in institutions that are quite traditional, but the patriarchy around parliamentary systems is particularly stark, and I do think having diversity of leadership is the way to break that down and change it, and for us to understand that parliamentary rules should be like culture and evolve over time. And so we need to evolve in a way where we are serving our communities and the people. So the evolution can't just be holus bolus, it needs to respond to what people are demanding. And we know, for example, young people are demanding to be able to participate, and they feel locked out at the moment. So you raise a really good point.
Your work beyond our shores, you've been involved in a few groups who've travelled a wee bit, and parliamentarians and politicians from across the globe. We were present at it when you gave a talk earlier this year about some work that you had done with a group of politicians where you ended up in Dharamsala and you met the Dalai Lama. Can you maybe give us a wee outline of that, what that group was? Sure. And what the work you were doing was?
Yeah, I've been particularly lucky in my life that my previous role for 12 years before becoming a parliamentarian was as the director for the British Council for New Zealand and the Pacific, and that involved a lot of international travel. I worked for the UK government creating friendly knowledge and understanding around big issues, so I did a lot of development projects in many places, including the Pacific and also Myanmar before it opened up. And so I'm naturally very interested in the global conversation, and I'm also quite aware that while New Zealand needs to carve its own path, in many ways we are beholden to the global conversation, so we need to be able to contribute to that and participate in it actively. One of the chair roles that I share currently in a cross-party role is as the co-chair of the Inter-parliamentary Alliance on China, and that looks at Chinese influence in the world, not so much Chinese, actually I should be very careful to say the influence of the Chinese Communist Party, and the rules-based order and questions around that. I've got particular views which is around ensuring that we are country agnostic, so this is not an attack on China, but there are human rights implications when the CRP has dominance in a society, and one of those societies right now of course is in Tibet, and I was lucky to be invited through my human rights work internationally by the Tibetan administration to go up to Dharamshala to meet His Holiness, along with some other parliamentarians, which was the co-chair Joseph Mooney and also Helen White from my own caucus. That was a fantastic trip. I think the biggest takeaways, apart from the the wonder of meeting somebody who has been such an amazing spiritual leader, is to understand also what an incredible political leader His Holiness has been, to create democracy outside of his own country, to create a tax system where people voluntarily contribute who are Tibetans, and also the strategic importance of Tibet in terms of the global climate infrastructure, and the fact that it is seen as the third pole, and the control of the waterways out of that, the four major rivers that come out of that, is of great strategic importance, not only to those countries and to China, but actually if they are diverted in certain ways will have devastating impacts on the globe for climate change. So all of that those things were really big takeaways from that trip.
So what is happening in terms of those things? Just hearing you talk about the rivers and the waterways, you can instantly see what the problem could possibly be there. And with Tibet being subsumed by China, and that it's basically putting those resources in direct control of the Communist Party.
Of the CRP, and that is the intention as far as I can see, and it will have huge implications for the surrounding countries, including India, but ultimately also it will impact on the other two poles, the Antarctica and Antarctic. So that's of real concern, and I think it's something that hasn't really been used in the advocacy around why it's so important for Tibet to find a middle way, which is what His Holiness wants. There is a young generation coming through that perhaps are not wanting to be as negotiated as His Holiness, so there could be some issues when and if he passes, and depending on the strength of leadership following him. So because what we're seeing are terrible human rights abuses in Tibet, including the cultural genocide, in my view, for the young people, which is that they are sent away to boarding schools, away from their families, unable to learn their language and culture. And this is around cleansing the Tibetan culture so that it cannot have the independent thought of mind to be able to thrive. Fortunately, the Dharamshala people and the people of India have welcomed Tibetans with open arms, and there are schools in North India where all of that is encouraged and able to flourish. But it's very precarious, and one of the most moving things that happened when we were in Dharamshala was having a dinner with the Speaker of the House, a very intimate dinner actually, and she was describing for us that she had never been to the homeland. She had stood on one of the rivers that separates North India from Tibet, and she felt that if her arm was long enough she could reach across and to touch the motherland. And it was incredibly moving the way that she spoke about it. I think as New Zealanders we have some sense of what our mana whenua and tangata whenua feel about the land and belonging to the land, and so I can't imagine the grief that is there for the Tibetan people in these conversations, yet because of the leadership of the Dalai Lama and their philosophy as well, they have an enduring hope that they will be able to find a way that works both for themselves and for the CRP.
Just on a different note too, you said you spent time in Burma, even when it was sort of quite a closed country. Can you talk a bit more about that?
So the British Council had a presence in Burma, as it was called, continuously over, I think it was 75 years, with a very small break. But it meant that we had, when I was with the British Council, there was a famous library there that enabled critical thinking and had books on democracy and so on. That library was an important place during the monk uprising, where all of the internet was controlled, and you'll remember images came out of monks being attacked and so on by the military junta. Those pictures were siphoned out of the country, out of the British Council library. That was a place of safe haven, and they had their own internet that wasn't subject to the censorship or the oversight of the military. So the British Council was a really important bastion of democracy there, and in fact one of my good friends, the previous country director there, a guy called Alan, used to go and visit Aung San Suu Kyi every Friday and bring books from the library for her when she was under house arrest. As it became clear that there was going to be a limited form of opening up, the British Council was placed to be able to do quite a large, I think it was a $60 million contract on access to justice. And this was about what the world could do, particularly through Britain, looking at how do you create the institutions of democracy that enable democracy to thrive. Things like the fourth estate and the media, which had never been free there, are new concepts. Access to justice was something that had not been experienced before. And so it was really important for those projects to look at what the Burmese people understood as justice and what the barriers and opportunities were. I was lucky enough to be the acting regional communications director, so I went through quite a few times when we were working on that big project. It's been very sad to see that over time Aung San Suu Kyi was vilified for her role in some of the things that happened to the Rohingya. And without excusing her behaviours, I have to say that I don't think democracy was ever in a true state as understood by the world, and therefore I think in many ways she was a victim of what was happening. The military still had control. Nowadays, I feel very optimistic that over the next few years we may well see democracy in a truer form return to Burma, and my understanding is that it's only a matter of time before some of the urban centres will also come under the control of the pro-democracy movement, which has managed to infiltrate into the military. And we talk about, I think, is it the watermelons, the colours of people being, you know, they might be part of the armed forces with the green uniforms, but actually they have the progressive heart and they are working with the pro-democracy movement.
That's good. Because we heard from, we actually had a Burmese guy here, Ted, and he was saying that Burma had also built this huge city, capital city, in the middle of nowhere.
Yep.
Which was sort of like a place to retreat if anything happened, I guess, for the government. And yeah, it was kind of strange. It was a very strange thing that happened because nobody knew about it. I didn't know about it until he told me.
We went over to Burma to have meetings because our Burmese local colleagues who were Burmese working for the British Council were not able to get passports. And so this is our way of trying to support them, and we were only able to go into the capital, to the old capital, and then they were building the new capital further north, but it was very much off limits to us. That was going back quite some time now. But I do have to acknowledge the local Myanmar community as well. They're incredibly well organised, and we've had meetings at Parliament too that Phil Twyford has pulled together with young activists from the Burmese community in Wellington and Auckland, and they're really politically astute, motivated, organised, and doing everything they can for their cause back home. And I think it's a wonderful thing to see this kind of loyalty and level of capability that we have. And the Dunedin community showed that when they put on their showcase and fundraiser a couple of years ago.
I mean, I imagine they would be, because there are horrendous things happening in Burma which we don't hear about, where various tribes who are not part of the main government group are still being attacked and killed.
Absolutely, and that is the same situation in many other conflicts globally, Sudan and so on, that unfortunately, because the media just seems to coalesce around the issue of the day, get lost, and we don't see, even in Cuba, for example, I'm in touch with some human rights activists based in Spain who are trying to get a spotlight on what is happening in Cuba, not only because of political imprisonments, but actually the level of hunger and starvation now is deeply concerning, and the Cubans are not able to get any international spotlight because there are just these other very dramatic conflicts that are taking up all the oxygen.
Yeah, I mean, I just saw that the other day. The United Nations passed another unanimous resolution, except for USA, I think, saying that they should recognise Cuba and take away the sanctions, which they put in '64 or something ridiculous. And it's kind of like, you know, I don't know, it's just like America is, it doesn't have any rules. There's nobody actually saying to America, actually, this is wrong. You know.
And let's be clear, the problems in Cuba are a result of the autocratic leadership there. The sanctions are not having the impact that that they thought it would have, and are absolutely affecting the citizens. So the question is, how do they get different leadership in Cuba? Very difficult without global pressure, and currently there doesn't seem to be any. So the activists that are working from Spain and providing the information are doing a good and valiant job. I have direct contact with some citizens in Cuba as well, and one of the things I've looked at doing is trying to work with community groups in Wellington and Auckland to see if there could be some kind of fundraiser to send some money to the Cubans just to be able to buy food. $200 New Zealand dollars would be able to feed a few families for more than a month. So the cost benefit of that would be good if people are looking to want to contribute somewhere.
If people wanted to contribute to supporting people in Cuba, what would be the channels to go through for that?
Look, just contact me and I can connect them to people.
Okay.
But I think it's going to take a level of organising that the Cubans have not been able to achieve yet, certainly not in New Zealand, that we are seeing with other community groups like the Palestinians now, the Ukraine group and the Myanmar group, who are all really organised.
So what does it take to get governments to shift? Because, I mean, we've talked about Cuba, we've talked about Tibet, we know what's happening in the Ukraine, we know what's happening in Gaza, and, we know there's aid sitting on the borders that could get in there. But there's just this funny game going on of yes you can, no you can't, and just high stakes pressure building on people to make a change, and yet it's almost deliberately slow, and people around I find myself scratching my head saying, well, if there's a ceasefire, why isn't the aid going in? Why aren't these people being fed?
Yeah, it's very frustrating, isn't it? I think it takes moral courage and leadership, I really do. And as we see more and more power vested in fewer hands globally, both politically but also commercially, we are not seeing the level of courage and people power that is available to us. When people realise that people power has always been the antidote for the to what is happening now, and when people organise and move, I think that's when we'll see change. To get that happening is leadership, real leadership, and that's because we know that many New Zealanders find what is happening absolutely abhorrent and share our frustration. So why are we tolerating a government that is not reflecting the common views of New Zealanders? And it is not acceptable for them to say, we know what's best with you. That is not the mandate that we gave them. They are there to represent us, and New Zealand has always played a very sophisticated role internationally, in my view, in being able to assert an independent foreign policy, even though technically we may not be independent. We do have defence allegiances, we do have trade allegiances that are quite contrary in some ways, and we should be using those to our advantage rather than being beholden to them.
As a very simple observer of governments, if you had to just take out a blank piece of paper and write down what the key or the KPIs of a government of a country are, what would you say they are?
I think stable governance is something, upholding the institutions of democracy, and that's around transparency, the rule of law, accountability, and following correct process. Being able to make morally correct and quick decisions in crisis, which is what we saw under the leadership of Jacinda Ardern, and listening to the people. Because
it doesn't feel to me as if that's what's happening in New Zealand, and it doesn't feel to me as if that's happening elsewhere. And we're called the Caravan of Hope, but we can sometimes scratch our heads and just feel like, where has hope gone? As a politician, what's your sense of hope for what's going on? You mentioned you have a 12-year-old living in your house. What's your hope for the world that they will inherit?
My hope is that I've lived long enough to know that the pendulum swings. So as bad as things might seem now, and things have got worse under this government, I have no doubt about that, the pendulum will swing back, and it is swinging back. And I think people will, their frustration will turn into action, and they will mobilise to make sure that we have proper democratically elected and governing bodies in power. What we need to be vigilant for is foreign interference, and we saw that, I think, with the protests at Parliament. We saw foreign money funding activities that did not seem to reflect our values as New Zealanders, and that's only going to get worse, not better. We're seeing misinformation campaigns that are used deliberately, even in local politics now, because there seems to be some kind of acceptance that misinformation is okay. So I think the pendulum will swing back, and people will start to push back at what they perceive as not our values as New Zealanders. And then the question becomes, what happens globally, and what kind of leadership role does New Zealand play there? We had a leadership role under Jacinda Ardern, and I hope that we will again when Labour's back in power again.
I'm thinking of actually a hope of just what's happened in the States, where despite huge money, the Mayor of New York is somebody who has principles, and also what's less known is the Mayor of Seattle is a woman who takes the bus to work, and the job was helping homeless people find houses. And that was purely because particularly the young people, I think, are fed up with a government that has no moral principles, basically. And they actually want something that is people who care about people and the environment.
I agree with you, and we saw that in Australia too, I think, at the last election. Again, what we need to be vigilant about, though, are our institutions of democracy. And when we see abuse of the use of urgency in the House, a lack of process, or the cabinet manual not being followed in relation to particular decisions that ministers might be making involving transferring money and projects in their electorate. I mean, we've raised questions over that a couple of times. Whenever we see a bypass of process or some kind of secrecy that says that we can't get the information out, I think we need to be nervous. And so when we look even at the privatisation agenda of this government, which I believe is a privatisation agenda, when we get money, public money going to private institutions, we don't have oversight then of how that money is spent and how they're accountable. That is a massive erosion of democracy, in my view. One example would be with the Gumboot Friday funding, where there are questions over the totality of I Am Hope and Gumboot Friday, because we know that individuals were paid salaries that were disproportionate to the rest of the mental health sector. If the Auditor General were to look into that, and I have asked him to do that, he's confined to looking at the public spend, which is very neatly firewalled off so that never the twain shall meet. These are questions we need to be asking of our politicians. Is it acceptable to set up business structures like that in a way that doesn't allow taxpayers to see how their money's being used and what the totality of the business model is? And we're seeing more and more of that incursion. So the dwindling or the erosion to our democratic processes is not something that's dramatic. It's happening as a form of erosion, and I think Sir Geoffrey Palmer speaks very eloquently to this in his latest book on it as well, worth reading. There are some young people who are also concerned and are very motivated in Wellington. I can't remember the name of them, but it's good to see our young people take this up.
Yeah.
We cannot take it for granted, because democracy is very fragile, despite the fact that we think that we've got such a wonderful democracy here in New Zealand.
And I guess the other thing is kind of like, because I've become very interested in the work of Joanna Macy. I don't know if you know her. And what we have to move towards basically is a sustainable economy, rather than one that's just promoted on growth and you know, exploiting people and the environment. And what I'm thinking is that we actually need to have somehow to take some of the policies out of party politics and say, well, actually, things like health and education, we need to have a long-term plan that doesn't go this way if it's Labour, that way if it's National. You know, we'll have the hospital, no, we won't have the hospital. We'll fund it, no, we won't fund it.
Yeah.
We'll do this, we'll privatise this, no, we'll publicise it. We'll, you know, could we have actually a parliament that actually is composed of people who actually care about the future of Dunedin, not Dunedin, but the future of New Zealand. Dunedin would be good too, but of New Zealand, who are going to say, well, this is the policy, we're going to look 50 years ahead, or 20 years ahead, or 200 years ahead, which Joanna Macy does.
Yes.
Like, what is the path that we can go? And that it should be, as you say, representing the people, not the views of the people in power, who at the moment seem to be in their own little world.
Yeah, I think you're reflecting what is a very common conversation, and we hear that all the time. People are losing faith and therefore in some ways participation in the electorate system because of their cynicism about what's happening in the system. The problem with our system is, of course, it's based on 3 years. Even 4 years may be too few, depending on which checks and balances we have. And we have an adversarial system with the idea that, you know, the free marketplace of ideas, that somehow the best solution will pop out. My view is that consensus decision making that we see in the Scandinavian countries works better. And the reason I believe that is because the policy takes longer to develop, but it also takes longer to implement and to change. And what we are doing currently in New Zealand is we're not measuring things. I wouldn't even say we're measuring things not properly, we're actually not measuring them. So when we look at the measuring change, we don't have the opportunity to see what is happening in the medium and long term, because, as you say, the policies have flip-flopped. The big question I think that we all face is, how do we value what we can't see? And for me, in the health space, that's prevention. But it applies to everything, climate change, you name it. And any rational person would go, yes, I'd much rather invest in prevention than in being the ambulance. But if we're not measuring the things that tell that story, we cannot tell that story. So we need to start looking. We've got this tyranny of silos with government ministries and agencies who collect their own data. We tend to talk in terms of outputs rather than outcomes, and nobody is aggregating the data horizontally to tell a story. So in mental health, for example, we tell a very medical story about mental health. We're not looking at social determinants like housing and poverty and things, and assaults on gender identity that we know form part of mental well-being. But those numbers should be in there, and no one is currently providing the insights. a lot of the data is there. So one of my things is that I'd really like to see when we're in government, and that I hope to influence, is that we really develop insights teams differently, and that we look across ministries and agencies and we input those numbers and we analyse them to be able to tell a profound story about why we need climate action, adaptation, and why our social services should be geared towards prevention and investment in prevention rather than reaction. So sorry for the long answer, but this is an absolute passion of mine.
I can see that. It was interesting, with you talking about the swinging pendulum. I mean, I've had a life in education, so I'm very down with how the pendulum goes back and forth as a former school principal. But and coming back to that question about what is the role of a government? What is their job description? To me, at a very basic level, it would be the education of the nation. It would be the health and well-being of everybody there, and it should be a central tenet of everything that we do. But it seems, and I'm not just talking about New Zealand here, the world at the moment is just in this sort of hurry up and get successful and with no view to the future. And I've always loved that quote by Barack Obama, who said, look, we can solve all the problems. We know exactly what we need to do. We just can't do it and get re-elected.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because you've mentioned health and education, and of course Labor's focus now is jobs, health, homes and cost of living. It is back to those basics. And that is what most people are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. In Dunedin here, I think between 60 and 70% of people earn their money through health or education. And so it is no wonder I call Dunedin the People's Republic of Labour, or the Socialist Republic of Labour.
Yeah.
But our values in those areas are so strong because we have so many people who understand the value of them and also understand that they need to be long-term and relational, not sort of transactional and privatised, which is the current direction of travel.
But it just seems to go against all logic that you would, because a lot of these people are business-driven people, and it seems to me that if they were running their business in the same way they seem to be running the country, they wouldn't last particularly long. They'd burn all the resources and just have nothing left.
Yeah, well, that's my theory of what's currently happening, is exactly that.
Well,
and for the first time we're hearing about a one-term government, because that is exactly what's happening, and people are starting to go, okay, there's only so long you can blame the previous government, and there's only so long you can tell us that the economy is going to improve. And when ministers, and Christopher Luxon in particular, stands up in the House and says things are getting better, and that is not the experience of people who are choosing between feeding their kids or keeping their homes warm, then they look incredibly out of touch. So I think that is what's happening right now.
But it just beggars belief that the people would, because we're not talking about idiots here. We're talking about people who have a brain and who are probably quite smart and have their own families, and they're probably very nice people to chat around the barbecue. But again, I come back to that idea of what is the purpose of a government? It's really getting under my skin. I just have this idea that we should shut the whole place down, reboot it, and say, what would we really like to have? Peace, people who are well and taken care of, not overs and unders, not sort of balancing off, which drug can you afford, rather than, and having an interest in the lives and the well-being of people in our country. And I guess this podcast, I mean, we've started by looking at a situation that is untenable to us as New Zealanders happening in Gaza. But in a way, we're part of a system that's promoting that.
Yeah, and when you say peace, I think peace and fairness. And the other thing I think is that what we are seeing, and I hope New Zealanders' eyes are really opening to this, is that part of the deliberate peddling of this othering of people, including Māori and including just last week with the trans puberty blockers issue and so on, is it's sleight of hand so that the uber wealthy corporates can dominate. I don't think we have a class system anymore that is kind of three-class system. We have ordinary New Zealanders, which is everybody who is not hugely wealthy, and then we have these kind of oligarchs that come from across the world, are super investors, and are dominating most of our business interests and our politics. That is not democracy. And to overcome the class war, I guess, they then turn their attention on othering other people to make us blind to the fact that what is really happening is that we now have a merged working and middle class who are all struggling just to stay afloat, let alone to get ahead, while all this wealth is concentrated in these few individuals, many of whom are global players. And we've got political parties that peddle that.
We're called the Caravan of Hope, and I did ask you to sort of express your hopes for the world that your child, who's age 12, might inherit. But as a politician, as a mum, as a resident in Ōtepoti, what's your hope for the next 5 to 10 years in terms of the world and what New Zealand can do in it?
I hope that the pendulum that we are seeing starting to swing back with some of those results that we've seen overseas will continue, that New Zealand will once again see reason and have a progressive government in. And I have a great deal of faith in New Zealanders and particularly our young people. When I went to the Big Sing recently in the town hall, it was incredible to see not only the amazing performances and teamship from the groups, but every group that performed almost got a standing ovation from every other group. There was so much love in Manaaki and so much inclusion, and right at the end everybody stood up and sang the national anthem in Te Reo, in English and with all the sign language, and loved it. Those are our young New Zealanders. They have the values. The challenge is how do we involve them and get them to participate, and for them to be hopeful and to know that it's important to participate so that our democracy can stay strong.
Okay, well look, Ingrid, thank you so much for joining us. We wish you well in your endeavours, and on behalf of this particular citizen, thanks for all that you do for our city and for advocating for us further north. So that's it from the Caravan, I hope, this week. From me, Brent Caldwell, may you be well, may you be happy, and may you live with ease.
And may the world be at peace.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're out.
Okay.
Well
You
done.
didn't know
Yeah.
I could talk that much, did you?